Welcome to the Season 2 premiere of The Chess Angle. I'm going to start with a brief update of what's been happening with the podcast, and then we'll jump into the content. I'm going to be discussing some chess theories and ideas that I feel are either complete myths or are highly overrated concerns at the amateur level. That's coming up, so stick around. It's Season 2. Hello everyone, my name is Neil. I am the founder and chief tournament director of the Long Island Chess Club in New York. And I'm going to start by talking about Elton John, the musician. And you may say, wait a minute, I thought this was a chess podcast. It is. Just stay with me for 1 second. I'm going to kind of bring this around to chess. But I'm mentioning Elton John because I wanted to start with something a little motivational. So here's the story. He performed last weekend at the Nassau Coliseum here on Long Island, which is a major venue. They have many concerts there for years. The New York Islanders played there, the hockey team, and it's right by my house. So when I heard he was there, this is probably his last tour, I had to go. So I got tickets, took the family. It was a fantastic show. He sounded great. And the main thing is that he's 74 years old. All right. 74 years old, still going strong, still performing, still sounds fantastic. And it just shows that you're never too old to do anything. And I mention this because Elton John has said a number of times in interviews that you're never too old to do anything or learn anything. That's kind of his mantra. And he said it at the concert as well. And it was just very inspiring. Of course, the music was great, but as I'm driving home, I'm thinking, you know, this applies to chess and pretty much any activity. You know, never think you're too old to start or to get better or that the parade has passed you by. So just seeing him and being reminded of his philosophy, it was just kind of inspiring. So I wanted to share that. So don't think the parade has passed you by. And what he did was before the closing number, which was Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, he actually thanked the fans. And he announced that this would be his last concert in New York. So it was kind of a historic moment for me. I can say I was there. But just wanted to start with that. Now, let's talk about the podcast itself. I want to share where my head is at and what my vision is for the podcast now that we're starting the second season. Hard to believe. So I'm likely going to keep the 20 episode arc in place. I kind of like that idea. Do 20 episodes. Take a little break, and then jump into the next season. Gives me some space to, think, and, I have some other things going on. And it'll be a mix of my solo episodes. That's sort of the default episode. But I'm going to have some interviews as well, do some book reviews. And I'm thinking of adding a segment where I will discuss my own over-the-board games or OTB games. Thematically, that is. I'm not going to sit there and give individual moves. That's going to get a little choppy. But I can discuss thematically what was going on and what my thought process was as sort of an application of some of the things we've been discussing. And that should work out because remember, this is kind of a side hustle for me. As with most podcasters, I do have a full-time job that I'm very devoted to. I'm in graduate school now. I'm also running the Long Island Chess Club, which I've been doing since 2007. So a lot of things on my plate, but good things. And that's where I'm at right now. All right, moving on. Some of you suggested that I should get a Patreon page. I received a few emails and some people said it to me in person. Now, what that is, a Patreon, for those of you who don't know, it's a site where fans of a show or YouTube channel, whatever the creative endeavor might be, they can contribute financially to support the endeavor, whatever it might be. Like I said, a podcast, a YouTube channel. It could be a band. A lot of musicians use it. It could be a writer, an author, things of that nature. And usually there's different tiers. Like there could be one tier where it's just a straightforward donation. Like, I'm a fan. I support what you're doing. Thank you. and, you contribute something. It could be like a one-off contribution, or in some cases it's a yearly donation, and it can be very inexpensive. It could be as low as like $1 or $2 a month, but, depending on how many people do it, it can add up, that type of thing. And, and as I said, sometimes you can have different tiers where you offer bonus content. So real quick for me, I'm not there yet. I had something similar. It wasn't Patreon. It was something else when I first started, only because I kind of thoughtlessly added it because when I was researching starting a podcast, people were saying you should do that. And then I just got rid of it. I don't know. I'm just not feeling it right now. I'm more about the content. And as it grows, I mean, it's already doing very well, the podcast, but that's something I might add down the road. So the short answer is, will I do a Patreon? Probably, maybe, but my head just isn't there yet. I just want to focus on the content. And, the only thing I do have, just for full disclosure, the only sort of monetization I have are the affiliate links, but I'm very comfortable with that because that doesn't affect your price. So an affiliate link, all that means is if I recommend a book, which of course I take very seriously, I'm not going to put any links unless I'm very familiar with the book or whatever product it is and I've used it myself. If you click the affiliate link, that just simply means that Amazon gives me a small commission from the purchase price, but your price is not affected. So for example, let's say there's a book I recommend and it costs $20. Whether you click on my affiliate link or whether you go to Amazon on your own, your price is the same. You're still paying $20. It's not like if you click the affiliate link, it costs you more. I simply get a cut from Amazon for referring you. I mean, it's a very small amount, but that's how it works. So that I'm comfortable with, right? Because your price is not affected. I'm getting the money from Amazon, which is fine. So I'm okay with that. But other than that, I really don't have anything like that. I'm kind of conservative in monetizing it because that's not really the reason I'm doing this. It's the furthest thing from my mind. It's really tangential. And, as far as having a Patreon, I'm just not there yet. Okay. That's not what it's about for me. Will I ever have one? Probably. But like I said, I'm just not quite there yet. And I'm just mentioning that because I know a bunch of people like, you should get one, you should get one. We'll get there. All right. So I just kind of wanted to address that. Now, as far as our links, our Twitter is at LI Chess Club, LICHESSCLUB, at LI Chess Club. I do the Long Island Chess Club's account. I don't have a separate one for the podcast, but I'm not a huge Twitter person or a social media person. I do post episodes and updates here or there, but I'm not, on social media that much. I'm kind of just in and out. As an interesting side note, I actually deleted all social media from my phone. Life-changing for productivity. If you read any article on productivity, one of the first things they say is to get rid of all social media apps from your phone. And it's like the best thing I ever did. They say the average adult spends about 2 hours a day on social media. So you might want to do a little self-assessment if you think you don't have enough time to study chess. Just an interesting little sociological thing there to think about. But anyway, I digress. Our Twitter is at LI Chess Club. If you want to email me with any comments or thoughts, it's info@thechessangle.com. So you can email me. And the last thing before we get into some chess, I want to thank you for your support, for listening to the podcast. We are one of the top chess podcasts out there. We're like a 15 to 20%, top 15 to 20% podcast overall as far as download analytics. So I appreciate it. And one thing you can do at no cost at all, if you like the podcast, if you could leave us a review, I would appreciate it. Again, not for my ego or anything, but it helps promote the podcast. It helps with searches. On Apple, you can leave a review, and Spotify on their app, they just started that a few months ago, maybe. You can, in the app, just click on the review. I don't think you can put written words, but I think you can give it stars. So if you like us, give us a 5-star review on Spotify. I would appreciate it. And if not, that's cool too. But just wanted to share that. And now let's get into some chess. So in this episode, I want to focus on some myths or really overrated concerns at the amateur level. You may have heard these maybe from like really strong players or from books. And I can tell you that they either just don't matter or they just don't apply to amateur games. And as I go through these, you'll kind of see what I mean. And the thing with all of these, kind of the theme is that amateur games are so error prone. I mean, even, for players up to as high as like 2000 or so. But in that range, let's say expert and below, the games are so error prone and filled with mistakes that, any type of quote unquote theoretical advantage or things of that nature just don't matter because the chance of someone making a mistake is so great. And as I go through these, you'll see what I mean. And the other thing is, I kind of know what I'm talking about with this because my whole life is amateur games. I'm not just talking about my games, but I run a chess club. I view, 15 to 16 or so amateur games a week, and I see this all the time. Everything I'm about to explain, I've seen in action time and time again. You see the same mistakes. You see like these wrong thinking patterns. I mean, with our regulars, I can look at a game and I can say, all right, that's an even end game there, but this guy's going to get in time pressure and he's going to blunder the game away. And I'm usually right. And I make these little bets with myself. I know that's like horrible. I mean, this is all in my head. I would never post anything. Or I'll see another game and I'll say, all right, his position's better, but he's not going to know what to do. Or I'll see another one and I'll say his position's worse, but he's so strong tactically that he's going to trick the guy. Things like that where, just because theory says that one player is better than another and quote unquote should win, it doesn't happen because like at the amateur level, it's like a free for all. All right. So, my whole life is amateur games. I see this all the time. And I wanted to share my observations about that, about these overrated concerns. And one thing that I've always said in the past, I'm going to say now and will continue to say, as an amateur chess player looking to get better, whatever you want to call them, an adult achiever, adult improver, you will learn more from amateur games than you will from master games. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but the problem with master games or really grandmaster games is the play is at such a high level and is so clean and doesn't have the mistakes that amateur games have that it's really hard to absorb it and internalize it. Whereas if you study amateur games, you're going to clearly see not only what to do, but what not to do. And the types of mistakes and moves and positions that you'll actually face in a tournament are going to be more obvious. As an example, I was talking to a friend of mine about this who agreed at the club. One of my favorite columns from Chess Life, the one that I would always turn to, was Lev Albert's Back to Basics. Now, I believe that column was retired recently, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, Lev Albert would analyze a game by two amateurs. An amateur would send in a game with his or her own annotations, and then Lev Albert would add his comments. And it was always very, very instructive. And I was talking to a friend of mine. He goes, it's the same for me. He goes, that's the first thing I look at as well. You will learn more from amateur games at this level than you will from grandmaster games. And don't get me wrong, of course you have to study grandmaster games in certain positions. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying an argument can be made that for many people, amateur games are much more valuable and easier to understand as far as what to do and what not to do. All right, so something to think about. So the first thing is the idea that winning the exchange is decisive, right? Because that's what a lot of amateurs think. Oh, I'm up the exchange. That means I'm going to win. Now, for those of you who may not know, being up the exchange means that you have a rook for a bishop or a knight, right? Because a bishop or a knight are minor pieces. Those are worth 3 points. A rook is worth 5 points. So you have 5 over 3, right? So if I have a rook and you have a bishop, if that's the exchange, then, I would be considered, to have won the exchange, right? Because I have 5 points over 3. So that's what the exchange is. And people think just because you're up the exchange that it's a one game, or maybe you're down the exchange and you're automatically going to lose. Now, all things being equal, that generally can be true. But at the amateur level especially, the exchange is tough. And it really depends on whose piece is more valuable. So if you have a knight, but your opponent has the rook, if your knight is on a really secure outpost, especially the 6th rank, and it can't be kicked away, that can actually be more valuable than the rook. And if the person who has the rook is not attacking anything, if the rook can't get on an open file because it's very closed, it may not mean anything. All right. Now, generally speaking, yes, it's an advantage, but not always. And in an end game where it's just king and pawns, let's say you have, a bishop and your opponent has a rook and it's king and pawns, your opponent's not necessarily going to win just because he's up the exchange. It really depends on our pawns being attacked, king position, initiative. And if the minor piece is better than the rook, that doesn't mean the person who's up the exchange is going to win. But the whole point of this is that, people think that, oh, well, I'm up the exchange, I'm definitely going to win the game, or I'm down the exchange, I'm definitely going to lose the game. Not true. I've seen many games where it's been the reverse, where it's drawn, or where the person with the bishop won because he was able to get past pawns. So the whole point is, without getting into like a real deep theoretical dive, don't get into the mindset that losing the exchange is decisive or that winning the exchange is decisive, because there are so many factors at play. And in many cases, the minor piece can actually be better than the rook. Okay. So the exchange is not always a decisive thing. Now, the second thing is the idea that having the bishop pair is this major advantage at the amateur level, of course. All of this is at the amateur level, all right? If we're talking about 2 grandmasters playing, we're having a different conversation. Now, the idea of the bishop pair is that, yes, they are powerful. They each cover squares that the other doesn't. They're long-range pieces, and especially in an open position, they can be very valuable. So yes, generally, theoretically speaking, having the 2 bishops can be an advantage. In fact, I read something somewhere where, some people argue the bishop should be worth like 3.25 points rather than 3 points, as if it's a little more valuable than a knight. I think that's kind of silly, but these types of theories are out there. But the problem is, and you may say, okay, why are you saying that having the bishop pair is overrated? Because, yes, you may have the 2 bishops, but most amateur players are not going to have the chops, as they say, or the skill to know how to take advantage of it. Okay? Like, I could give you this fancy machine that does something awesome and better than everyone else, but if you don't know how to use it, it's not going to help you. It's the same thing. So if your opponent has the 2 bishops and you don't think, oh, I'm lost, and conversely, don't think, well, I have the 2 bishops, so it's automatically winning. Most amateur players, they're not going to know what to do, because that's often like a subtle difference. Now, if you're talking about 2 GMs and it's a fairly open position, having the 2 bishops can often be decisive. But at the amateur level, it's an overrated concern. All right. Because in many cases, the knight can be more valuable, or the person with the bishop might blunder. There's just so many factors. It's like I said at the beginning, the amateur games are a free for all. But the idea that, oh, I have the bishop pair, like the game's going to win itself. No, it's not. It's an overrated concern. I talked before how I see, amateur games every week. Many times those type of minor piece battles where someone will have 2 knights and they'll win the game, or someone will have a bishop and a knight and, that person will win the game, or someone will have the 2 bishops with a clear advantage. I mean, you look at it and it's like, if you were to put it in the computer, it would be an overwhelming advantage, and they end up losing the game or drawing the game. So don't get, caught up in that whole thing. All right. Now, the next thing, you may have heard the saying, okay, this is the third thing now. If you're only going to study one phase of the game, study the end game. I think that's nonsense at the amateur level. You need to study all areas. I mean, everybody needs help with tactics and improvement with tactics, but you need to know your openings, your middle game, and your end game. All right. If you're a struggling amateur player or you're looking to really boost your rating and you only study the end game, I mean, yeah, it's going to help you, but it's not going to be thorough enough. All right. It's like, somebody working out and they only work out their arms or they only work out their legs. It's going to be uneven. So that might be true for more advanced players about studying the end game. But at the amateur level, you have to study all three phases, the opening, the middle game, and the end game, and tactics, not just one. All right. So let's move on to number 4. There's a belief that some amateurs have, and again, this is based on things I've seen at my club and elsewhere, but this is especially an over-the-board thing, that if your opponent is low on time, that you should try and clock him. So let's say, let me give you a practical example. Let's say it's a game 90, like at my club. Let's say you have 20 minutes left and your opponent only has 3 minutes left. All right. And obviously he's moving fast because he doesn't want to run out of time. You might feel the need to sort of rush as well and match him to kind of force him to make a mistake. But that's the worst thing you can do. All right. If you have plenty of time on your clock, but your opponent doesn't, just play like you normally would. Use your time. He'll eventually crack. But that's one of the worst things you can do, is to rush as well, where you match him, because then you can make a mistake and then you'll end up losing the game. And if you're using a time delay, if you hang a piece or it's a severe blunder, that 3 minutes, that'll be enough for him to win, or even 2 minutes if there's a delay, because if you're down a piece in the end game, it's usually pretty clear what to do. So don't match your opponent just because he's low on time, because you may end up blundering yourself. All right. Now, number 5, I was hesitant to mention this because I've said this so many times before, but it bears repeating and it fits into this whole idea of myths. And that's the idea that you have an advantage simply because you have the white pieces. All right. Now, I'm going to speak about it a little differently than I have in previous episodes. I'm going to try to be a little more thorough about it. So I believe, you've heard me say this, at the amateur level, that is, that having the white pieces does not give you an advantage. Now, let's kind of go from the beginning. Logic dictates that because white moves first, that he would have an advantage, because basically black is always playing catch up, right? White moves and then black answers. It's always defensive. And logically, that makes sense. But what everybody forgets and what nobody talks about is that that's only true if both players are performing or exhibiting, I should say, near perfect chess or close to perfect chess. So the idea that white has an advantage because he has the first move is only true if both players are playing very clean, blunder-free chess, i.e. at the GM level. So if two grandmasters are going at it, if Nakamura is playing, Magnus, then yes, we're having a different conversation, because then white's theoretical advantage from having the first move is going to be a big deal. But at the amateur level, goes back to what I said in the beginning, because so many mistakes are going to happen on both sides, both subtle mistakes and overt mistakes, any advantage by white is completely negated. Because remember, in order for white to have an advantage because he moves first, you need to have near perfect play on both sides. That's part of the theory. But because both players are going to make a lot of mistakes, like I said, they might be subtle mistakes or, more gross mistakes. But the fact of the matter is, because amateur games are filled with mistakes, any advantage you have as white is negated. So that's just utter nonsense that you have an advantage as white. So now I know what you're going to say. Well, why do I seem to be more comfortable with the white pieces? Why do I do better? And I'm going to tell you why. It's because you're not spending enough time studying your openings with the black pieces. People confuse being more comfortable with white than, they confuse that with having an advantage as white. All right. And they're not studying enough with the black pieces. They might be more comfortable, but that's what it is. All right. And this isn't just an isolated theory that I have. Others agree. In fact, where I first heard this was in Chess Life many, many years ago. I forgot who said it. I think it was a GM who actually, had this whole theory that at the amateur level, because there are so many mistakes, that the idea that you have this big advantage because you move first, it's completely negated. All right. And again, all this stuff is at the amateur level. Obviously, if we're talking about two GMs, you can disregard everything I'm saying, but that's not what we're talking about. This is a podcast for amateur players. This is not for title players. All right. Because at the highest levels, moving first is going to have an advantage, but be aware that theory has shown that the advantage of moving first, even with perfect play on both sides, it's very slight. It's not like decisive. It's a slight theoretical advantage. But like I said, at the amateur level, it's completely wiped out. So don't get, into your head that, I'm somehow at a disadvantage, or I should be comfortable just drawing as black and I should play for the win as white. That's GM stuff. That's GM world, right? Try to draw as black, try to win as white. You should try to win at the amateur level, regardless of what color you have. And in fact, for me, and I'm not just saying this, I actually seem to, many times be more comfortable with the black pieces. I mean, I have my London system as white, I play that, but a lot of times as black, I play the French defense against E4, and I do my Nimzo or Queen's Indian against D4. And, a lot of amateur players, they don't know, especially if they're like under 1800, they're not always sure what to do. So I'm really comfortable on both sides of it, and that's how you should feel. So I guess I would end it by saying, if you feel more comfortable when you have the white pieces, then you need to study with the black pieces more, or vice versa. Maybe you're more comfortable with your black openings, then you need to work on your white openings, okay? Something to think about, but it's my firm contention that the idea that white has an advantage at this level is just not true. Okay. Sorry, I got a little long-winded there, but I've seen this time and time again. All right. Based on my observations. Now, the last thing to wrap this up, a lot of amateurs feel that the key to success lies in openings. And I see this all the time where somebody's trying to get better. Maybe they're rated at 1,000 or 1,200. And they just study openings over and over, openings and all these variations. But then when they go to an actual tournament game, they end up falling apart. And the reason is very simple. Most of the time at the amateur level, the book opening is not going to happen. It might happen for a few moves, but then at some point, it's going to go off book, and then they don't know what to do. Or they prepare a line, hoping the opponent will play it, or assuming the opponent's going to play it, and then they play something else, and then they get frustrated and they don't know what to do. And, they're hanging pieces, they're missing things positionally, and they think that just memorizing opening variations is going to do it. It's not true. It's kind of what I said before when I said about the end game, that you should only study the end game. You need to study all phases of the game. Opening, middle game, end game, tactics, chess psychology, the thought process, the whole thing. There needs to be a balance. All right. But a lot of players think that, they're just going to memorize openings. Now, in some cases, they'll get pretty far. I mean, when I interviewed Tim Mirabile, that's episode 20. That was the season 1 finale. Tim talked about this, where he'll play significantly lower rated players. Tim's a master. He's like 2,200. He'll play a much lower rated player at the club. And if he plays a book opening, they might play pretty reasonably for a while if he stays in book. But as soon as he gets out of book, they fall apart. Or as soon as you start threatening something, they fall apart. All right, so let me just review this real quick. So again, these are kind of overrated or, concerns or sort of myths, a combination of both. So the first is the idea that the exchange is decisive. It's not. It's really position dependent and piece dependent, and very often the minor piece can be better than the rook. All right. The second thing is the idea that the bishop pair is always decisive at the amateur level as well. It's not true. Theoretically, it might be true, but you need the chops and the skill in order to take advantage of that. All right. And that's not always the case. The third thing is the idea that, if you're only going to study one phase of the game, study the end game. not really true. First of all, you shouldn't just study one phase of the game, and there needs to be a balance. But most players end up making mistakes well before the end game is even reached. Okay. The next thing is the idea that if your opponent is low on time, don't try to clock him. All right. Just use your time, play good moves, and just wait for him to crack. Because if you try and match him and you have plenty of time on your clock, you might blunder and make a mistake as well. And then you'll throw the game away. Because remember, he might only have 2 or 3 minutes left, but if you drop your queen or you drop a piece and it's in the end game, 2 minutes with a 5-second delay, that's more than enough time for him to win, if you're down a piece at that point. All right. And then number 5 is the idea that you have an advantage if you have the white pieces. I think I've said more than enough on that, but you know how I feel about that. And then the last thing is the idea that just memorizing openings is the key to success. All right. So all this stuff is based on my own experience, games I've seen. These are some things just to think about. I know some of this may be controversial. Some people may not agree, but I see this all the time. And it's just some ideas for you to think about at the amateur level, because it really is different than 2 GMs playing who are at a whole nother level. But I wanted to share this stuff. So again, just to review our links, our Twitter is @LIChessClub. Our email is info@thechessangle.com. If you like the podcast, I'd appreciate it if you would give us a good review on any of the major platforms. That's not something I'm going to repeat every episode. I don't like to hound people with that, but we appreciate it. And I will tell you that our next episode 22, will be our first interview format for season 2. And I have 3 people lined up so far as guests. So that's going to be cool. One of them will be for the next episode, and then we'll have the other 2 at some point. So good stuff. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day.